Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. Man, it has been a long time since I put out a brief, so hopefully we'll be able to get through some of the issues that have been kind of a top priority for us here over the past few weeks. Just a small administrative note, I'm actually still working on the format for this brief. It's going to change quite a bit, I think, as we move forward and try to figure out some of the more interesting things to talk about. So for now, really the only thing that I'm going to talk about in the domestic United States is petroleum, oil, and lubricant production. We'll jump back to the more kinetic incidents and some of the more interesting critical infrastructure stuff, but like I said, I've got a lot of catching up to do and a lot of data to sift through, so we'll have to revisit that at a later date. But for now, I have primarily been focusing on POL, or petroleum, oil, and lubricant refineries. Based on how often very large facilities have exploded or caught fire lately, I thought it prudent to start cataloging the major incidents that we have seen this year. So far this year, the most serious incidents that we have seen have been the fire at the BP Husky Toledo refinery, which ended up killing 2 people, and the incidents surrounding the Marathon refinery in Garyville. Starting with the BP Husky Toledo incident, both BP and federal investigators have been pretty tight-lipped regarding the incident that claimed the lives of 2 refinery workers. This is completely expected following such a serious event that results in the death or serious injury of workers. The long-term effects of this plant being offline are unknown, but as it stands, one of the largest refineries in the Great Lakes region is offline, and from what I can tell, the entire refinery is offline. And unfortunately, it's pretty likely to stay offline for a significant amount of time because BP just announced significant layoffs at this facility following the fire. Moving to the Marathon refinery in Garyville, unknown parts of the facility are still offline following a fire and possible explosion which resulted in unknown damage back on October 7th. That's pretty much all I've got, a big fat nothing. Don't know any more than something happened, don't know what, don't know how bad it is, and don't know when the facility is going to be back online. This incident is interesting because, as some of you may remember, this is the second incident involving the Garyville refinery this year. Back in February, this facility suffered an explosion in one of the towers that are used to process distillates for gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Though, like anything surrounding the POL refineries, the details on these incidents are sketchy at best, so we never really get precise details following any incident. Either way, it's not a good thing when things keep exploding at the 3rd largest refinery in the United States. Moving back in time a bit, we remember that this hasn't been a good year for Valero, who has witnessed several large fires at their refineries around the country this year. Back in April, we saw a very large fire at their complex in Monroe, Louisiana, which injured 8 workers, and more recently a large fire broke out at their Corpus Christi facility on November 3rd. Wrapping up the recent events surrounding our POL refining capabilities, many refineries are offline on the West Coast for both planned and unplanned maintenance, such as 2 Phillips 66 refineries in Washington State and in California. So some of you might be asking, so what? Well, the bottom line is that even though we're dealing with a lot of unknowns, it can't be good for this much refining capability to be offline at once. Again, we are missing crucial data. We know the total production capacity of every single POL refinery in the U.S., but when you start factoring in partial shutdowns or planned maintenance with unknown timetables, we can't really get a good bead on what the bottom line is. It's not like the Colonial Pipeline incident when basically the entire network was dead in the water for 6 days or so. Most of the specific data that we need to understand what impacts these shutdowns will have is either proprietary data that you have to pay thousands of dollars for, or again, concealed for national security reasons. Wouldn't be a super good idea to point out exactly what the vulnerabilities of our refineries are. However, we can generally say that, again, this many refineries being offline, down for maintenance, damaged in some way, or still recovering from damage that occurred years ago, is not good for our national energy security. Now, the next question becomes, why? Why are so many refineries burning or exploding lately? Is this out of the norm, or is this something that we're just noticing more? Well, we can get into the specifics of the reported incidents at a later time because there are complex problems with the ways that these major events are reported, but generally speaking, I think that these major incidents are the result of a few factors, which are overstretched crews, inexperienced workers, increased demand resulting in maintenance issues, poor maintenance in general, and of course, the more deliberate actions that, while probably rare, we will never know about, but nonetheless must factor in as well. After all, we cannot completely dismiss the insane rhetoric that we're seeing from world leaders specifically regarding energy. Whatever the reason for these fires or explosions, we will never get enough info to make a call either way. What all of this really means is that we are really counting on all of the workers at these types of facilities to be vigilant and be careful. The average citizen can't do a John Brown thing about a refinery fire. All we can do is observe and plan accordingly if a refinery fire breaks out that is going to immediately impact prices or availability, as was the case with the fire at the Whiting, Indiana facility back in August. So if you work at a POL refinery or really any large industrial facility, please be careful and remain vigilant. You are on the front lines and the first and sometimes only barrier preventing a lot of really bad things from happening. Anybody who's worked in industry knows that oftentimes safety takes a back seat, especially if your supervisor says do this or you're fired. But the game has changed now, and a large industrial accident that could have been prevented is not just going to hurt a company's bottom line, it's going to directly impact the lives of everyday citizens. Likewise, pay attention to your company's security practices. If you see someone you don't recognize in a place where they are not supposed to be, say something. Take a few minutes to check out your work center and make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and that the right stuff is tagged out and that there isn't anything extra hanging out in the workplace. You all know what to do. I certainly don't need to lecture anyone. I just think that at this point, the only thing that we can do is remain vigilant, report safety or maintenance violations when you can, and keep an eye out for anything shady. Moving on to significant governmental actions, the Biden regime announced this week that they will continue tapping into the strategic petroleum reserves, releasing another 15 million barrels shortly before the midterms. The short-term impacts of this are, of course, gas prices being kept artificially low, even though nationally gas prices are creeping up again in places like California. As the midterms are now over, we might see the Biden regime slow down on tapping into the SPR, as the motivation to keep gas prices low is not really necessary anymore, at least until the next major election in 2024 or until some other distraction is needed on a national scale. The grand strategic question is, and has been, how far will the Biden regime go? Will they continue to tap into the SPR until there simply is nothing more to tap? I don't think anybody knows that at this point. Clearly, we have the benefit of data. We know how much POL we consume nationally, and we know how much we are importing and producing here at home, and we know how much the SPR currently holds. When the SPR starts running dry, the Biden regime will be faced with a rather simple choice considering the complexity of the POL industry. Either increase imports or increase domestic production. Clearly, Biden's visit to sweet-talk the Saudis back in June didn't work out, as OPEC just a couple of months ago announced that they would be cutting production. Granted, OPEC doesn't necessarily put all of the weight of their decisions on their relations with the United States, but there is enough of a link there to be concerned. Either way, the clock is ticking. It is true that even though the very first executive order Biden signed was to negatively impact the POL industry, the Biden regime has also quietly renewed some oil leases out west in order to boost domestic oil production. Most people think it's too little too late and only lip service, but at this point it's something, I guess. As always, it's hard to say how much of an impact these things have, and the average citizen is most likely focused on the political and social implications rather than the large strategic economic ones. It's quite clear that there is a concerted effort being undertaken by powerful governments, individuals, companies, and non-governmental organizations, which are intended to control populations via high petroleum prices and availability too. You can't effectively organize a revolt if you have to choose between food and a tank of gas. And both food and transportation are actively being used right now as weapons by governments all around the United States and around the world. Speaking of power and control, the Biden regime has also declared that they will be extending the C-19 emergency until April of next year, in a move that surprises literally no one. Not much to say about this one other than when April rolls around, it'll be extended again, and so on. Again, not much to say on that, just wanted to let everyone know who had not heard. Moving on to the more spicy event that has come to light, we at last have the still-breaking FTX crypto laundering scandal. Here's a brief rundown of what's happened. FTX was the fifth largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, or at least it was up until a few days ago, when their founder and CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, suddenly got on a plane and disappeared into the night, urging that there had been a cyber attack and for all users to delete all FTX software immediately. Well, details are still kind of sketchy, but it seems like Bankman and other senior FTX staff had installed backdoor code into FTX software that allowed them to literally drain every user's account, or at least that's what many users have reported after they logged in to see that they had a balance of 0. Due to the nature of how cryptocurrency exchanges work, it's not clear as to how much money has been stolen. So far, figures have been in the ballpark of a few $100 million worth, but some estimates have been as high as tens of billions of dollars. Here's where the story gets a bit sketchy, and also why you will not hear much about this at all from corporate media, or at least they're not going to make the link. And that is the relationship between the Democratic Party, FTX, and Ukraine. What is undisputed fact is that FTX had partnered with the state of Ukraine, with President Zelensky personally being involved in FTX's plan to, quote, turn Bitcoin into bullets. Many of you remember that Ukraine had set up a specific banking system in coordination with Ukrainian banks, so that money could be sent by anyone around the world to support Ukraine's efforts to stave off Russia's invasion. At the time, this was touted as a way of preventing the usual fraud among NGOs that happens during every crisis. Fake charities pop up and money gets stolen or otherwise doesn't make it to the intended recipients. We all know how less than honest individuals sometimes make their way into the charity world. So this system was touted as one of the first options that people had to donate money and be sure that it actually did make it to who needed it, claims which are backed up by Ukrainian banks. Well, it turns out that this system, or at least the cryptocurrency side of the system that was maintained by FTX, was all a scam. FTX was the major entity who accepted donations of cryptocurrency and exchanged that currency for the fiat currency that the Ukrainian government needed to run the war. Remember, all of this was blessed off by the Ukrainian government, and the donation page itself was literally hosted by the Ukrainian government on a government website, a website which mysteriously vanished a few days before the FTX scandal broke. So the picture becomes a bit more clear. But wait, there's more. Sam Bankman, the founder of FTX, was the second largest donator in the history of the Democratic Party, coming in just behind George Soros in terms of campaign donations for the midterm election that we just had a few days ago. This is especially troubling considering how much of our tax money has been sent to Ukraine. We have all been following the reports of the donations of U.S. tax dollars to Ukraine, but we never really see the meat and potatoes of how and where that money gets transferred. We just see reports of Congress agrees to send $37 billion more dollars to Ukraine. We don't actually see the account numbers that this goes into, or how these transactions are handled. What we see is the U.S. government pumping U.S. tax dollars into the money pit of Ukraine. We don't know where it goes, and the half-hearted attempts to provide some accountability for that money have not been fruitful at all. And now we find out that the guy who's neck deep in the entire world of Ukrainian finance has absconded with the dough. Oh, and by the way, he's one of the largest Democratic donors in history, and he only created FTX in 2019. So the internet is ablaze with people being flabbergasted and incredulous that the following scenario has actually gone down. The general thesis that many people seem to see right in front of their eyes is that the US government gave Ukraine a lot of money, which was, how should I say, put in the washing machine and transferred back to the Democratic Party in the form of campaign donations. If this is true, or even a shred of it is true, then this would obviously be a pretty bold move, and one might call it the crime of the century. Though in my opinion, the crime of the century has already occurred. Anyway, this incident is almost too insane to believe, even after all of the stuff we've been living through over the past couple of years. I myself do not know the full story, no one does just yet, but I am inclined to believe that what happened is exactly what we think happened. Even though we do not precisely know how U.S. tax money is at play here, we don't know how that factors into the whole crypto thing and how finances are transferred, or if U.S. tax dollars were a part of this fraud at all, I'm still inclined to be a bit pessimistic on that front. However, taking a step back for a moment to look at things strategically, if this is true, then I think we have much less time than we think we do. A washing operation as bold as this one, potentially compromising official U.S. government transactions of U.S. taxpayer money. Man, Bernie Madoff had nothing on this. Excepting, of course, the C-19 and jab issue, this could very well turn out to be the crime of the century. Oh, but the two incidents are not entirely unrelated, because you want to guess who funded the research that so-called proved that ivermectin did not work? Yeah, that research was funded by a group called Together, which was bankrolled by, you guessed it, FTX. So there's that. Anyway, it's also tiring and can be quite depressing if you dwell on it. So we'll just leave it there for now, and we'll come back and talk about some more details that are sure to come out over the next few weeks. That pretty much wraps up the domestic issues for now. We'll focus more on some more specific issues at a later time, but right now let's jump to Europe. There have been many major incidents that have taken place since the last brief, but I wanted to focus on just two events for right now. First up was the attack on the Nord Stream LNG pipelines in the Baltic Sea. Here's what we know so far. Back on September 26th, terminal operators detected pressure drops on both the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. Various naval forces were dispatched to the scene of the suspected leak, where this large kilometer-wide gas field was discovered. Over the next few days, several more leaks were detected. Additionally, various military sonar arrays throughout the region reported hearing underwater explosions at the same time the leaks were detected. Clearly, this was a deliberate attack, an act of sabotage. The question remains to this day, who did it? Taking a step back for a moment, I must acknowledge how serious of an event this is, and that I cannot really go into much detail about what I'm about to say. Some of you might know that I have a bit of professional history surrounding undersea cables and pipelines. Most of the information surrounding what goes on down on the seafloor is very, very secret, and exactly what's capable is not public knowledge. So all of that is to say that when I first heard of this attack, I became more concerned than I have been in a very long time. I truly thought that nukes would be in the air by the end of the day. And that's because this event is again supposed to be one of the opening moves of a war with Russia. Throughout intelligence circles, the cutting of undersea cables and pipelines has widely been considered to be one of the opening moves of World War III. This is because both the US and Russia, the two biggest power players in the undersea game, are traditionally believed to reserve such actions only in case of war. It's what's been done and prepared for since the Cold War, and there's just a sort of cultural understanding out there. It's very similar to the idea of ballistic missile submarines. We here in the US have ballistic missile boats, and so does Russia. And we both have fast attack subs shadowing each other's boomers pretty much at all times. The understanding is that if anyone gets the order to launch, the ballistic sub gets their missiles off, or at least tries to, before the other guy's fast attack boat torpedoes them. That's just the understanding that's in place. A grand game of nuclear chicken. Similar situation with undersea cables. Both the US and Russia play games, and we map and tap each other's cables, or at least try to. Russia doesn't have too many undersea cables or pipelines, but of the few pipelines that Russia does have, arguably the two most important are the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline systems. So here we are again, witnessing an event that is, by all historical accounts, supposed to be one of the opening moves of a very kinetic nuclear war. Both cable and pipeline cutting are on the list of things that have happened already this year, so maybe I need to take my own advice and reassess things from a fifth-generation warfare perspective. Sure, anything can happen, but 2 months have elapsed since the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline systems, and we haven't all been burned up to a crisp just yet. But the question remains, who did it? To that, my answer is this. Every Five Eye partner, plus Norway, Sweden, probably Denmark, and the Netherlands, and of course Germany as well, all of these entities know 100% who the real culprit is. These nations have spent an obscene amount of money and dedicated a significant portion of naval intelligence to tracking Russian vessels, particularly the ones capable of laying charges to cut pipelines. So the US government knows for sure who did it.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
When we look at the list of nations that can do something like this, we're looking at pretty much anybody. This is mostly due to the depth at which the attacks occurred. If we're talking a super deep depth, only accessible by specially crafted submarines, we would really only be looking at just the US or Russia having this capability. However, since the leaks occurred in comparatively shallow water, the list of suspects is pretty large. So let's take a look at motivation. Let's see who would be motivated to blow up the Nord Stream pipelines. Well, we can rule out Germany, since that pipeline was their most direct source of natural gas, at least prior to the diplomatic problems that arose from the Ukrainian war. Just to be clear, as a side note, the pipeline wasn't actually in use at the time of the detonations, which has been kind of the result of the diplomatic deadlock regarding energy and the Ukrainian war. Speaking of the Ukrainian war, what about Russia? Russia built and owns both pipeline systems, so what would they have to gain by blowing up their own pipeline? Well, for one, Russia could blow up the pipelines knowing that Western powers wouldn't be willing to show the highly classified proof that Russia did it, which would allow Russia to avoid the international finger-pointing that comes whenever they throttle the pipelines. So Russia could get what she wants, denying Europe a critical supply of natural gas, while at the same time remaining blameless. That works, right? Well, not so much. The issue is much more complicated than that, for one, and secondly, Russia has so far been content to throttle the flow of natural gas whenever needed. Why would they blow up something when they can simply throttle it? Plus, ever since the Ukrainian war has kicked off again in earnest, Russia would have to expect that Europe would sanction the pipeline anyway, so it wouldn't be a solid source of income. Granted, the situation for liquid natural gas in Europe is pretty desperate right now, so who knows what Germany in particular might have done. So we're sort of stuck, aren't we? Well, not really. Who do I think blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? I think the United States did it. Why do I think that? Well, it's pretty simple.
Let me answer the first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Yes, that was a clip from February of this year in which the President of the United States clearly and directly threatens the Nord Stream pipelines. Granted, Biden does not directly say, "We will blow up the pipelines," but come on, man. I think that's pretty clear. So if we take this quote at its full value, I think that's clear enough for me to draw an assessment. However, if we wanted to go a step further and recognize the fact that a lot of times Biden doesn't really know what he's talking about, we can look at the international reactions to get a better understanding of who it might have been. And that's really the other main reason that I think it was the United States, the reactions of nearby nations. While the blasts took place in international waters, the blasts were within the economic exclusion zones of both Sweden and Denmark, both of which have stated that they are not treating this attack as an attack on their nation. Which is fishy, because they certainly could have made that claim and militarily have been preparing for just that scenario for decades. It's a case of militaries preparing for X event, training long and hard, solidifying their response if X event occurs. Then X event does occur, and suddenly everybody's all about solving the problem diplomatically. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Granted, I do have a sneaking suspicion that, based on what I've seen over the past few months, world leaders are genuinely concerned about starting a kinetic World War III. I think that, of course, this is an issue to get more into at a later time, so I don't want to digress too far. But I do think that, despite the fact that we're fighting, in a military-industrial complex, and a lot of money is being made on all sides by the threat of conflict throughout Europe, I don't think that anybody really genuinely wants it to actually break out in earnest. Which is some halfway good news, I guess, because it seems like everybody had the justification to do something militarily about this pipeline issue, and no one has. Everybody's trying to kind of sweep it under the rug. Now, this could be because the European nations are genuinely concerned about poking the bear in any meaningful militarily, way, not just rhetoric. They could be concerned about that for real, or it was the United States. And they knew about it ahead of time, or they figured out, so they're not trying to push the investigation too hard. Either way, I am absolutely positive that the dudes over in the Russian Guji Directorate are punching the air right now, because blowing up pipelines and cutting cables is pretty much the only reason they exist. So, all in all, what does this mean? Well, the entire Nord Stream project is probably dead in the water, so to speak. Repair is going to be tricky, the issues of corrosion and winter weather being the chief concerns. Plus, nobody's really keen on rebuilding a pipeline that's just going to sit there idle anyway. As long as the Ukrainian war rages on and Western hysteria continues with it, the Nord Stream pipeline project is probably going to be over. It will be interesting to see what the Western response will be in the long term, though we've already seen levels of mild-mannered temperance that are only present when one is the culprit of what one is investigating. So time will tell what washes up with this one. In a similar vein, the other major, supposedly World War III starting event occurred just a couple of days ago, and this was the missile strike that killed 2 farmers along the Polish border. These 2 farmers were killed by at least one projectile at approximately the same time that Russia had launched a large-scale rocket artillery barrage in Ukraine. Initial reports were that the 1 or possibly 2 projectiles that killed the farmers were an errant missile fired by Russian forces. However, subsequent analysis of some of the debris reveal that the projectile may have been a missile from a Ukrainian S-300 air defense system. Right now, a lot of finger-pointing is going on, with all sides engaging in propaganda as expected. The response from Ukraine, Poland, and the rest of NATO has been very telling. In the minutes after the incident, the only voice we heard was Zelensky's, who was foaming at the mouth to get Poland to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which is the one that refers to an attack on one member state is an attack on all. In other words, Zelensky wasted no time at all to draw NATO into their war, just as he has done from the very start. Also interesting has been the response of the United States. Seeing as the United States has also been chomping at the bit to further their money laundering operation in Ukraine, the United States has been very quiet. The Pentagon immediately issued a press statement basically saying, "We can't corroborate that the missile was Russian in origin," and Biden outright refused to answer a reporter's question on the topic as well. Pretty fishy for a regime which has been looking for every opportunity to expand the conflict. Perhaps most troubling has been Poland's response, which was quite serious as you would expect following the death of Polish citizens. For a while there, Poland was considering activating Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which basically invokes military consultation of member states. And Poland still might do that. That would be probably the minimum that they would do. If the missile had actually been Russian in origin, we'd be looking at the classic military response of some kind of surgical strike on probably the facility that launched the missile or the unit that launched it. But now that we find out that the missile that killed 2 Polish citizens is almost certainly Ukrainian in origin, well, now the rhetoric has completely changed and the incident is now, quote, an unfortunate accident. I feel like NATO and Poland are going to brush this one under the rug and try to memory hole this one. Why? Well, there are a few theories that I and most of the internet immediately had. The fact that Ukraine immediately called for Article 5 to be invoked was suspicious, especially considering the speed at which this announcement was made, right? It's almost like it was pre-prepared. I mean, the crater was still smoking when Zelensky got on TV and made his claims that, Poland should invoke Article 5. So this whole incident is so fishy that many people are thinking that this whole thing was intentional on the part of Ukraine, an intentional false flag attack intended to force NATO into the conflict. The whole thing gets a lot more fishy considering that Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, during a press conference made the statement that Ukrainian air defense interceptor missiles have had a 100% success rate, meaning that every interceptor missile that has been launched has destroyed its Russian target or functioned as intended. So the story that this might have been a malfunctioning Ukrainian missile that missed the Russian missile it was aiming for and landed in Poland, that story, it would have been likely in any other situation, but man, as time goes on, it's looking less and less likely. But again, this is all very heavy with speculation at this point. I think that once again, the larger lesson here is to be very careful where you get your information from. I myself have taken a step back, or rather a giant leap back from all things Ukraine because the truth is completely non-existent regarding most things that have happened during the war so far. Sure, there are lots of smaller, more tactical lessons learned, that stuff is helpful, but if I had to pick one lesson that I've learned so far, it's that 5th generation warfare is real, and that this war is just as much of a psychological one as it is physical. So when it comes to where things stand right now, the situation throughout Europe is tense for sure, and will be so for a long time. The impacts of cross-border fires, whether it's an intentional false flag attack, a genuine mistake, or something else, combined with blown-up pipelines, will most certainly be felt intensely for the foreseeable future. Fortunately, neither event has resulted in us being burned to a crisp, at least not yet. And on that somewhat cheery news, I think we'll wrap things up for today. Am I concerned about the fate of Europe, and by default the rest of the world? Yes, absolutely. I can only say I'm concerned so many times before it gets tiring, but we'll carry on. We're already far past my own personal benchmarks for when I would have imagined a global war to break out, which I think means that World War III has already started, as I've been saying for about a year now. Can we walk things back and head in the right direction? Sure. Will we? I don't know. Either way, the result is the same for average people like us. Make good decisions, learn new things, meet new people, and drink some water. Taking things one day at a time certainly seems to be a good place to start, so let's keep doing that. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. I hope to finish up some of the more doctrinal stuff we've been working on pretty soon here, so stay tuned for that. And of course, we'll be working on some communications stuff in the near future as well. So thank you again for all of your support, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.